The New World Order means different things to different people, but to those who expect to be in control of it, it means the same thing. It means all the world under their control. They believe that somebody must rule. After all, people are too darn dumb to know how to rule themselves. They figured that that's their role.
Author H.G. Wells, the man behind The Time Machine and War of the Worlds, would write about a planned world state in which there must be a common faith and law for mankind. In 1939, he would publish a full book on the matter called The New World Order. Wells again has a similar vision, stating that national individualism has to go and that sovereign states must end. He then goes on to write, in the great struggle to evoke westernized world socialism, contemporary governments may vanish. Perhaps his most chilling prediction is that countless people will hate the New World Order, be rendered unhappy by frustration and their passions and ambitions through its advent, and will die protesting against it. Many of them quite gallant and graceful-looking people.
With few exceptions, the world now stands as one. A year and a half ago, in Germany, I said that our goal was a Europe whole and free. Tonight, Germany is united. Europe has become whole and free. The world can therefore seize this opportunity to fulfill the long-held promise of a new world order. We can find meaning and reward by serving some higher purpose than ourselves, a shining purpose, the illumination of 1,000 points of light. We have before us the opportunity to forge for ourselves and for future generations a new world order, a world where the rule of law, not the law of the jungle, governs the conduct of nations. When we are successful, and we will be, we have a real chance at this new world order, an order in which a credible United Nations can use its peacekeeping role to fulfill the promise and vision of the UN's founders.
For the creation of a secret society, and we know about this because there were some people very intimately involved with this organization who wrote about it. One of the best authors on this topic is Professor Carroll Quigley. He wrote several books, and Tragedy and Hope is the best known of his. He described in detail the secret organization created by Cecil Rhodes, and he explains in these books he knows about them because he was invited by the organization into its inner circle. He was never a member of it, but he was invited in as their historian, and he was allowed to see their secret records and papers and study them for several years. And he knew all the important players, and he understood what it was about, and so he wrote these books. It's an amazing thing because he laid out in great detail what the purpose of the organization was and how they were the major players in all of the big international events since and including World War I. The bottom line is that you take the roots of that organization and you find out that they created in all of the British dependencies what they call roundtable groups. And then around those little roundtable groups, they created front groups. And the purpose of these front groups and roundtable groups was to penetrate into the governments of all of these different countries, to penetrate into the media centers, to penetrate into the educational systems. In other words, to penetrate into the social fabric, the power centers of society, and literally take them over from the inside without anybody being aware that they were controlling influence.
The year is 1917, and Representative Oscar Callaway enters a disturbing statement into the U.S. congressional record. The statement reveals why J.P. Morgan interests hired 12 high-ranking news managers. The 12 were asked to determine the most influential newspapers in America. They were to figure out how many news organizations it would take to control generally the policy of the daily press of the United States. The 12 found it was only necessary to purchase the control of 25 of the greatest papers. An agreement was reached. The policy of the papers was bought, and an editor was placed at each paper to ensure that all published information was in keeping with the new policy. Soon, that policy would be defined by a front group formed by J.P. Morgan and his colleagues. In fact, Morgan's personal attorney was founding president of the organization, the Council on Foreign Relations. Today, the CFR maintains that its goal is to increase America's understanding of the world. However, the actual objective of this highly exclusive club is revealed by the rare admissions of the insiders themselves. In the early 60s, a Georgetown University professor collects information for a book favorable to the network of powerful men who founded the CFR. For 2 years, Professor Carroll Quigley is allowed to examine the confidential papers and secret records of this network. Quigley reveals that these men aim to create a world system of financial control in private hands, able to dominate the political system of each country and the economy of the world as a whole. In short, they seek total and quiet control of the entire world. And the CFR is their most visible conduit for carrying out that agenda. CFR members include America's wealthiest tycoons, as well as the highly placed elite in government, academic institutions, tax-exempt foundations, and the establishment media. Ruling Class Journalists, written by Richard Harwood, describes the CFR membership as the ruling establishment in the United States. The Washington Post article boasted that news reporters who are CFR members do not merely analyze and interpret foreign policy for the United States, they help make it. Who are these policymakers? Many of their faces are familiar. NBC's Tom Brokaw, CBS's Dan Rather, ABC's Barbara Walters, Jim Lehrer of PBS, William F. Buckley of National Review, media mogul Rupert Murdoch, owner of the giant multifaceted News Corporation. These media heavyweights, and many others like them, are members of the CFR. Powerful corporations are also invited to become members. At the close of the 20th century, CFR influence presided over far-reaching consolidations of media control. In 1995, CFR members Michael Eisner of Disney and ABC's Thomas Murphy merged their media empires. Soon after the merger, the Disney-ABC empire becomes a CFR corporate member.
Norman Cousins Global Governance Award, Walter Cronkite.
First, we Americans are going to have to yield up some of our sovereignty. That's going to be, to many, a bitter pill. Pat Robertson has written in a book a few years ago that we should have a world government, but only when the Messiah arrives. He wrote, literally, any attempt to achieve world order before that time must be the work of the devil. Well, join me. I'm glad to sit here at the right hand of Satan.
Thank you very much, Richard, and I am delighted to be here in these new headquarters. I have been often to, I guess, the mothership in New York City, but it's good to have an outpost of the Council right here down the street from the State Department. We get a lot of advice from the Council, so this will mean I won't have as far to go to be told what we should be doing and how we should think about the future.
As a teenager, I heard John Kennedy's summons to citizenship. And then as a student at Georgetown, I heard that call clarified by a professor named Carroll Quigley.
Professor Quigley's 1,300-page book, entitled Tragedy and Hope, described the small elite, which he said actually runs the United States.
When Bill Clinton took office in 1993, he appointed his Rhodes Scholar roommate as his personal foreign policy advisor. Strobe Talbot had spent 22 years as a writer for Time magazine, where his writings revealed his eagerness to get rid of patriotism, American sovereignty, and independence. In the July 20th, 1992 Time, Talbot wrote an article entitled The Birth of the Global Nation. He enthusiastically predicted that in the next century, nationhood as we know it will be obsolete. All states will recognize a single global authority. In fact, wrote Talbot, national sovereignty wasn't such a great idea after all. Talbot bragged about how our national sovereignty and independence have already been diminished by the International Monetary Fund and the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, or GATT agreements. He boasted that the internal affairs of a nation are no longer off limits to world government. For his article, Talbot received an award from the World Federalist Association, a group committed to world government, and a congratulatory letter from Bill Clinton.
You know, quite a few years ago, when I think it was when Bill Clinton was inaugurated, was in one of his speeches, he recognized one single individual as being very important to him philosophically. And that was a bit of surprise because I knew about the individual, and some of you may know about him, but it's worth looking into. And his name was Carroll Quigley. He wrote the book Tragedy and Hope. Now, the important part of Tragedy and Hope in Carroll Quigley is that he claims that he was on the inside and part of the group that, you know, did the planning. But why did he write Tragedy and Hope? To expose these people behind the scenes? Because he believed they were far enough advanced, it didn't have to be secret, they could be out in the open, and this is the way it works. It's a tragedy if you don't accept this, and there's hope if you know who runs the show. That's my interpretation, but I believe it's correct. But let me read a quote from him, and thinking about where he's coming from. He says, the argument that the two parties should represent opposed ideals and policies, one perhaps the right and the other of the left, is a foolish idea, acceptable only to the doctrinaire and academic thinkers. Instead, the two parties should be almost identical, so that the American people can throw the rascals out at any election without leading to any profound or extensive shift in policy. I mean, I think that is a profound statement, because it tells us what's going on and why things don't change.
After World War I, the International League of Nations arose as a precursor to the United Nations in 1919, under what seemed to be the vision of President Woodrow Wilson and his 14 points.
The League of Nations was the first attempt at the New World Order, the first attempt at a global government based on the model of collectivism. And it was the brainchild of the elitists, the ancestors of the very people who are still working on this project. They're collectivists, the very wealthy people. They're the ones in this country who dominated the powerful tax-exempt foundations, like the Carnegie Endowment Fund for International Peace, the Rockefeller Funds, the Ford Foundation, and groups like that. These people were on record, even way back then, that they had to have a new world government, and they dreamed of that being embodied in the League of Nations.
Wilson was aware of the elite and their control over society. In his book, The New Freedom, published in 1913, he discussed such a group. Since I entered politics, I have chiefly had men's views confided to me privately. Some of the biggest men in the United States, in the field of commerce and manufacture, are afraid of something. They know that there is a power somewhere so organized, so subtle, so watchful, so interlocked, so complete, so pervasive, that they better not speak above their breath when they speak in condemnation of it. Ultimately, this insight did not spare him from becoming yet another puppet of the global elite.
Nearly 200 years ago, Thomas Jefferson wrote, "If the American people ever allow the banks to control the issuance of their currency, the banks and corporations that will grow up around them will deprive the people of all property, until their children will wake up homeless on the continent their fathers occupied."
Every $100 bill which the Federal Reserve System prints and is sold to the United States at full face value represents a $100 loan. Even though the government pays for it, they still pay interest.
100 years after Jefferson, Abraham Lincoln pondered these same issues. The government should create, issue, and circulate all the currency, he said. Creating and issuing money is the supreme prerogative of government. Adopting these principles will save the taxpayers immense sums of interest, and money will cease to be the master and become the servant of humanity. Hundreds of miles south of the banking capital of the world, New York City, just off the coast of Georgia, Jekyll Island provided a winter retreat to the rich and famous. Here, in a conclave intended to remain secret forever, 6 international bankers plan what is to become America's most powerful private institution, the Federal Reserve System. It is at the urging of the famous poet Ezra Pound that Eustace Mullins begins his own personal search for the truth about the origins of the Federal Reserve.
Ezra Pound's young artists and writers friends were killed during World War I. Ezra wanted to know why they died. Digging book by book, row by row, in the entire economics section of the Library of Congress, I found this little magazine with the Jekyll Island story in it. When I took that to Ezra Pound, he was so thrilled. It was the biggest discovery of his life.
Back in 1910, they called themselves the Jekyll Island Club. Collectively, members represented more than 1/6 the wealth of the entire world.
We had, in 1912, a very popular president, a Republican named William Howard Taft. The bankers needed Woodrow Wilson to sign this act into law. He did not have much charisma. He had not a chance against William Howard Taft. They drug Theodore Roosevelt out of obscure retirement. Roosevelt formed the Bold News Party and split the Republican Party and elected Woodrow Wilson. That's the only way they could do it.
Woodrow Wilson, immediately after his inauguration, called a special session of the Congress to do away with the protective tariff, which had been the thing that had built this country. The second thing that happened was that the income tax came in. And the final thing was the creation of the Federal Reserve, which took place in December, around the Christmas holidays in 1913, that put the cap on this whole revolution.
Most of the senators had gone home for the Christmas holidays. We call that in legislative circles having the skids greased. And the skids were greased, and they just slid it right on through. Without much fanfare, the president signed it. It became law of the land.
One of the major opponents during the Federal Reserve Act battle was Representative Charles Lindbergh from Minnesota, who, interestingly enough, was the father of aviator Lucky Lindbergh, the first guy to cross the Atlantic Ocean solo. And Lindbergh fought them tooth and nail and referred to the Federal Reserve Act as the worst legislative crime ever perpetrated in the history of the United States. And that may indeed well be true.
By 1916, even President Wilson was worried. He lamented, "The growth of the nation and all our activities are in the hands of a few men." Near the end of his life, Wilson said that he had been deceived into signing the Fed into law, reportedly murmuring just before he died, "I have unwittingly ruined my government." Did the creation of the Federal Reserve represent a takeover of the United States by shadowy international financiers? Certainly, the Fed was designed to serve somebody's interest, but whose?
Not the American banking community. It was the international banking community. The Morgans were an international family. The fortune had first been made in England, but they were allied with the Rothschilds and others in England, and one of their agents drafted the script for the Federal Reserve.
Economic power, political power go hand in hand, and it's like Mayer Rothschild of the Rothschild banking family in Germany said, "Give me control of a nation's monetary system, and I care not who writes their laws."
Nobel Prize Milton Friedman claimed that the Federal Reserve caused the Great Depression by deliberately reducing the amount of money in circulation.
Depositors all over the country were frightened about the safety of their funds and rushed to withdraw them. There were runs, there were failures of banks by the droves, and all the time the Federal Reserve System stood idly by when it had the power and the duty and the responsibility to provide the cash that would have enabled the banks to meet the insistent demands of their depositors without closing their doors.
Congressman Louis McFadden, chairman of the House Banking Committee during the crash, agreed, saying, "The Great Depression was a carefully contrived occurrence by international bankers seeking to bring about a condition of despair so that they might emerge as the rulers of us all."
There was a memo circulated in advance of the stock market collapse. All the big guys, or the insiders, let's say, got out of the stock market during that 4-year period. They all got out. They were cash heavy when the market crashed. They were able to buy up major corporations for pennies on the dollar.
Franklin Roosevelt's own son-in-law called the Depression the deliberate shearing of the public by the world money power, triggered by the planned sudden shortage of call money in the New York markets. Insider Joseph Kennedy's wealth grew from $4 million in 1929 to over $100 million 4 years later.
It is not a coincidence that the biographies of all the Wall Street giants of that era, John D. Rockefeller, J.P. Morgan, Bernard Baruch, etc., all marvel that they got out of the stock market just before the crash and put all their assets in cash or gold. On October 24th, 1929, the big New York bankers called in their 24-hour broker call loans. This meant that both stockbrokers and customers had to dump their stocks on the market to cover their loans, no matter what price they had to sell them for. As a result, the market tumbled, and that day was known as Black Thursday. According to John Kenneth Galbraith, writing in The Great Crash, 1929, at the height of the selling frenzy, Bernard Baruch brought Winston Churchill into the visitors' gallery of the New York Stock Exchange here to witness the panic and impress him with his power over the wild events down on the floor.
The goal of the Royal Institute and the CFR is nothing less than one world government. In 1950, CFR member James Warburg testified before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and said, "We shall have world government whether or not you like it, by conquest or consent. If you want to catch a ride in the Anglo-American machinery of the Illuminati today, you will agree to be told what to do."
It's been reported that you and your wife are in the globalist CFR, which is a Council on Foreign Relations. I'd like to know if that is true.
Well, first of all, I'm not the Council on Foreign Relations. I don't know if I'm a official member. I've spoken there before. It basically is just a forum where a bunch of people talk about foreign policy, and so there's nothing. There's no official membership. I don't have a card or, you know, a special handshake or anything like that.
Now, why is that important? It's important because the avowed purpose of the Council on Foreign Relations is to create a new world order, a global government based on the model of collectivism. And that includes the elimination of the United States as a sovereign nation.
The Council was heavily criticized during the 1980s for being an organization hell-bent on destroying national sovereignty in favor of a world government. So many of its members hid their association with the organization. Dick Cheney had this to say in response to a question by David Rockefeller.
It's good to be back at the Council on Foreign Relations. As Pete mentioned, I've been a member for a long time and was actually a director for some period of time. I never mentioned that when I was campaigning for re-election back home in Wyoming.
Now, you are the president of the Council on Foreign Relations, all right? Yes, sir. You guys toy with countries of the world like toys, don't you? You're like the Illuminati, you're the Masons, you control everything, don't you? That's the rap on you guys.
What's so interesting now, though, is who's on the chessboard. It's the toys, if you will, are a lot more than states.
Notice that Mr. Haas does not deny that the CFR has massive control over the geopolitical arena, and instead tries to focus on the separate entities outside of nation-states.
Even more suspect is a private group called the Trilateral Commission.
David Rockefeller and Henry Kissinger are among its some 300 influential members.
The Trilateral Commission, rich and powerful business and political leaders from Japan, Europe, and North America. The New York-based policy group was formed in 1973 by Chase Manhattan Bank Chairman David Rockefeller.
Current and former members include Presidents Clinton, Bush, and Carter. Names like Brzezinski, Christopher, Kissinger, and Schultz.
Although this group with only 300 members seems to be at the apex of the power structure, there is yet another group formed in 1954 that is even smaller in number and has a greater influence on world events. Meet the Bilderberg Group. This elite group meet annually around the globe. There is a core group of members who have attended every year for decades, such as David Rockefeller, Henry Kissinger, and Queen Beatrix of the Netherlands. These members invite others who are politically and socially relevant at the time. Each year, around 140 people are in attendance.
You just came back from meeting with the Bilderberg Group. The Bilderberg Group are, you know, when people who are conspiracy theory people, they send me mail, it's usually about the Bilderberg Group. And I get these books on my front door, which I'm uncomfortable with. And it's all about the Bilderberg, like they're the modern day Illuminati. Are you a member of the Bilderberg Group?
I don't think we're supposed to talk about this.
The elite, however, occasionally have a difficult time ruling themselves. At a 1991 closed-door meeting of fellow internationalists, billionaire and former CFR chairman David Rockefeller praised his media allies, but his confidence that his words would not leave the room was later broken.
We are grateful to the Washington Post, the New York Times, Time Magazine, and other publications whose directors have attended our meetings and restricted their promises of discretion for almost 40 years. It would have been impossible for us to develop our plan for the world if we had been subject to the bright lights of publicity. But the world is now more sophisticated and prepared to march toward a world government.
In his 2002 book, Memoirs, David Rockefeller Jr. Arrogantly wrote, quote, "For more than a century, ideological extremists at either end of the political spectrum have seized upon well-publicized incidents, such as my encounter with Castro, to attack the Rockefeller family for the inordinate influence they claim we wield over American political and economic institutions. Some even believe that we're part of a secret cabal working against the interests of the United States, characterizing me and my family as internationalists and conspiring with others around the world to build a more integrated global and economic structure. One world, if you will. If that's the charge, I stand guilty, and I am proud of it." End quote. He wrote on page 405.
Mr. McDonald, I'm not a conspirator. I think even Buchanan would vouch for that.
Well, you are a member of the Council on Foreign Relations.
Robert Welch. No, I don't think so. Yeah, I'm a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. Is that a conspiracy?
Well, you've certainly. Well,
let me just tell you what Newsweek says this. The John Birch Society considers communism only one arm of a master conspiracy in which socialist American insiders are plotting to establish world government. Now, it also says, and here's Director John McManus, that's your public relations director, saying that former Secretary of State Alexander Haig and CIA Director William Casey are two of these master conspirators who are plotting to establish world government. Now, what do you say? That kind of silly, asinine statement is what makes people laugh at the John Birch Society.
Well, Tom, I'm sure being a long-standing member of the Rockefeller apparatus and as a member of the Council on Foreign Relations of long-standing, you're fully aware that there is an elitist core in this country that has seen value in subsidizing communism, of protecting communism.
It has?
Sure.
You're accusing me of subsidizing communism?
No, I'm saying
because
that
I happen to belong to a
there is an elite core
study group.
No, wait a minute. There is an elite core in this country that has dominated American society.
Well, I'm not one of them.
Well,
Trilateral
Commission, the Trilateral Commission, Council on Foreign Relations.
State Department, I suppose.
Well, let's face it, they've dominated the State Department for 40 years, and pretty much openly
All right,
so.
but what are they trying to do?
Well, their objective is to try to bring about a gradual transition in our society, a dissolving of sovereignty, and a moving steadily to the left on the political spectrum.
Well, who are they?
Belief, the elitist groups that I mentioned, particularly key individuals and policymakers in the Council on Foreign Relations.
Is the International Monetary Fund part of this?
Well, I would say the International Monetary Fund has certainly been set up for the purpose of facilitating that transfer of sovereignty and transfer of wealth on the road.
All right, we
to
elected
something.
Mr. Conservative.
Let me just finish the point, because otherwise we're going to have a lot of unanswered questions. That you are looking at a group that has worked to bring about a dissolution of national sovereignties on the road to world government. And certainly you're familiar with local Professor Carroll Quigley, who has been part of your club, in which he admitted all this. And he said in his book, Tragedy and Hope, the only thing I disagree is that we've worked to keep it a secret. And you see Arthur Schlesinger Jr. writing way back in 1947, says, yes, this is the hidden policy of America. But we can't tell the American public because they're too unsophisticated to see the value.
What is the
Right.
instrumentality of world government?
Statement
What
is
is the
like,
instrumentality
of all the
through
things
which...
to say about Arthur Spencer, that's the silliest statement I ever heard. He never made anything like that.
Well, let me suggest that you read the May-June issue of the Partisan Review of 1947, Tom, and you can read it for yourself. It's called
But
the
Arthur
Schlesinger
Schlesinger said there was
Manifesto.
a conspiracy,
Oh.
a conspiracy
Oh,
to
he didn't
promote
use the
communism.
word. Oh, no, he didn't use the word conspiracy.
I
He
think
said the
Tom-
objective
Oh,
was
what
to
kind of
bring about...
nonsense is this?
Well, let me finish. I'll tell you. He said that the objective, the secret policy, which we can't tell the American public because they're not sophisticated enough to see the value, is that through a steady result of erosion of new deals, we bring the American society steadily to the left.
All right.
And through a sound concept of benign containment, we merge into the vital center of the socialist left. Those are his words, not mine.
You think John Kennedy was a member of that conspiracy?
No, let me ask you this. The World Federalist Movement in the post-war era contained a lot of people who eventually broke with it, and a lot of people thought the UN in the post-war era looked toward world government. Indeed they did, up until 48, 49. But a lot of them said, look, we were utopian. That's over and done with. We can't move. And a lot of them came in Kennedy's government. Schlesinger was in there when they were fighting in Vietnam, launched the effort in Vietnam. Schlesinger was behind the Bay of Pigs. In other words, look, isn't there some move that occurred in the post-war era that now has been dissipated because nobody believes in the utopian ideal of world government anymore?
Well, I think there are those that realize that moving straight from a prototype of the United Nations into world government perhaps is tactically impossible. But phasing out increasingly national sovereignty into regional government and phasing out sovereignties into international treaties in multiple areas could be a route.
The whole movement toward, quote, interdependence.
Yeah.
NATO is part of the conspiracy?
Well, there are certainly elements in NATO. There are people in NATO who are very strongly dedicated to the defense of the West. But at the same time, you find in NATO a steady dissolution. You find a growing weakness as a NATO policy dominated by State Department policies that has not worked.
Well, it's a regional grouping, and I think, therefore, it may be suspect by the John Birch Society.
We're talking with Congressman Larry McDonnell, who has recently been elevated, I guess, to chairmanship of the John Birch Society, succeeding Robert Welsh. We'll be back in a minute.
They have a fundamental constitutional right to keep and bear arms as the Constitution allows. And unfortunately, there are those in our society, including elements of the PTA nationally, not always locally by any stretch, but nationally, who would believe that the federal government should restrict the right of citizens to keep and bear arms.
Can I
what
get
kind
back
of
to
grades do you give Ronald Reagan as president? And what kind of grades does the John Birch Society give him?
Well, I would say in his speeches, Pat, you'd have to give him close to an A, B plus to an A. But in his performance,
what's
somewhere...
most disappointing?
Well, I think the fact that the rhetoric is going one way and the record is going another.
Let me ask you about this conspiracy again.
Well, you can take the issue of one of the major problems of this country is inflation and the problems of the destruction of the dollar. And the fact of the matter is, in spite of promises of the contrary, Reagan has not moved to correct the deficiencies. We're now back to Keynesian economics despite comments to the contrary.
Do you think that's a result of the conspiracy you mentioned? Is there somebody working on them to get the inflation so that this country will be weakened?
Well, as a man who campaigned against elitism, as a man who in his campaign rhetoric said that he would not be having the Council on Foreign Relations trilateral types dominating his cabinet, he's got about 250 members of such in his administration.
Well, let me ask you about Bill Casey. Now, I've known Bill.
250 members. Of the trilateral commission.
I've known Bill Casey
in
since
the administration.
I've known Bill Casey, the director of CIA, since World War II. As a matter of fact, in World War II, he was my boss. Now, your public relations director, the John Birch Society, says that Bill Casey is a part of this conspiracy that's trying to bring about world government.
Before he became CIA, one of his big jobs was aiding in the transfer of technology and goods and so forth to the Soviet Union, helping the Kama River Project, the Export-Import Bank, helping to finance these things.
Is the Export-Import Bank part of the conspiracy?
I think the whole drive, the fact that the American people have been tapped steadily, especially since World War II, to finance their enemies and to have the massive technology transfer to those who would do it. You know that from the Braden Doctrine in the agency, which you're very familiar with, and the feeling that we must somehow subsidize the, quote, non-communist left. That's among our so-called allies.
Braden was
and in country after country, that turned out to be the communists, the crypto-communists masquerading as the non-communist
that's Mr. Mitterrand, who has taken the strongest position against the Russians of any Western European
Well,
leader.
he was about to lose everything at the polls, and he had to show some sign. It's very difficult to say exactly how far that will
Congressman McDonnell, he's been using the term conspiracy.
No, I didn't use it.
No,
For
no.
heaven's sakes, Pat. The John Birch Society used it.
I don't want to go through the tapes.
Well, it is. Don't blame it on me. He used it.
You've used it 45 times.
That's right. They say this is a conspiracy.
All
I
right.
want to know what the conspiracy is.
Tom.
I'm trying to find out who's in it and what agencies of government in it, because I want to fight it along with you.
You look
And
like...
Great, Tom. Let me tell you, Tom.
You tell me,
you know,
how can I join the John
my
Birch
question
Society?
has been
Well,
forgotten.
gosh, Tom, you got no problem at all. All you need to do is write a letter to the John Birch Society, Belmont, Massachusetts, 02178, and tell them that you would like to purchase for $2 a copy of the Blue Book. Tom, you read it, and I think if you're a dedicated American, you will agree with every word. Then you get in touch with me, and we may even sign you up.
Yeah, but it says here in one of your publications, not just anyone can be a Bircher. Now, how
I
can
said
I
not
be a
just
Bircher?
anyone. Now, if you don't believe in the Constitution and limited government and free enterprise and biblical values of morality,
I believe in all those,
you
but
would
I
not
don't.
qualify.
I don't
Well,
believe there's a
right.
conspiracy.
He'd make a lousy candidate.
Tom, you know, as a matter
Is
of
Pat a
fact,
member of the conspiracy? He's a member of the press.
Let me ask you, he's used, now Mr. Braden's used for the 47th time the term conspiracy. Now let me ask you seriously, when you use people like Casey, who is on the Council on Foreign Relations, David Rockefeller's Trilateral Commission, what do you mean, or do you mean, is that your term, the term conspiracy?
well, there are many different levels of the problem. But yes, the term has been used, the term of conspiracy. When you have a group of people...
They're actively collaborating, and at the other end of that point of collaboration are communists, and on this end of the point of collaboration is Bill Casey and trilateralists and CFR
Al
guys.
Haig.
You have people who are part of the elitist structure of this country that have dominated this country openly for 40 years.
I know, but they're not, is that a conspiracy?
Now, wait a minute. If people quietly working together for evil objectives, two or more, that by definition is a conspiracy. You have, by their own admission, you look at The Tragedy and Hope by Professor Carroll Quigley, who's a member of this elitist group. He says, sure, we've been working this. Sure, we've been collaborating with communism. Yes, we're working for a global accommodation. Yes, we're working for world government. The only thing I object to is that we have kept it a secret. And I think we've gone so far along, we should come out and say,
I'll bet you $1.50 that Bill Casey doesn't know who Professor Quigley is. I don't.
He's at Georgetown a number of years ago.
He died a couple of years ago, and he wrote The Tragedy and Hope. He's a very noted member of your club, Tom.
Tom, you've got to broaden your reading a little bit.
That's right. You've really got to...
What I ought to do is read more about conspiracies, and that's why I'm interested in what
Well, I'll tell you what you ought to
do
do is go back and look at your founder, Edward Mandell House, because he wrote the book Philip Drew Administrator, and in this, Colonel House said that what he envisioned for the world was a world government along socialist lines as envisioned by Karl Marx. Now, that's your leader, now, Tom, so you got to go back to the beginning.
Well, his leader was Woodrow Wilson. Do you think he was a communist?
No, I think Woodrow Wilson was his follower. I think Edward Mandell House dominated Wilson, not the other way around.
Mm-hmm. And so Edward Mandell House, that was, we ought to make that clear. He was
Colonel
President Wilson's principal
alter
advisor.
ego, that's correct.
Yeah. So he is the real villain from which all these conspiracies...
No. He is a major figure, Tom, but there has been, unfortunately, in the West, an element. There are good members in the Council on Foreign Relations, dedicated, patriotic people. You've had Sproul Braden, who was a member of the Council of the Birch Society.
Bill Buckley's
and
a member.
Council on Foreign Relations. You've got some dedicated people, but the driving forces have very clearly been willing to collaborate, subsidize, work for technology transfer for what they feel is some type of an accommodation and merger. And I submit this would be a disaster for the American Republic.
As they unfold in the shooting down of a Korean jumbo jet off the coast of a Soviet military outpost. Among those killed when the plane came down was a Georgia Congressman, Larry McDonald. We'll find out what his wife has to say. She believes there was a conspiracy to kill her husband, and she is thinking now about trying to succeed him in Congress. On Capitol Hill, Georgia Congressman Newt Gingrich called the incident a premeditated attack by the Soviet Union.
Candidly, I think what happened is that somebody yesterday made a decision to shoot down an airplane, that they discovered after the plane was shot down that Congressman McDonald was on the plane, and that what was an act of beating up on a small country, South Korea, suddenly became a major international incident involving the death of an American congressman.
The official Soviet news agency TASS today reported that former President Richard Nixon was scheduled to fly on that ill-fated Korean jet that was shot down by the Russians. But TASS says Nixon canceled his reservation at the last minute because the CIA warned him against taking the flight. Because the CIA warned him against taking the flight. Because the CIA warned him against taking the flight.
The Soviets had tailed the distinctively shaped commercial jumbo jet for 2.5 hours and then shot it down.
This has been a condensed history of the globalist organizations and their rise to power. But is there a reason they meet behind closed doors? A shadow world government has been mentioned, but to truly understand what that means, let's go back to this iconic warning from President Dwight D. Eisenhower.
Progress toward these noble goals is persistently threatened by the conflict now engulfing the world. It commands our whole attention, absorbs our very beings. We face a hostile ideology, global in scope, atheistic in character, ruthless in purpose, and insidious in method. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes.
Despite the elite utilizing Bernays' methods, in conjunction with the military-industrial complex they had erected, a modern arm of this organization was exposed in what came to be known as the Iran-Contra scandal. Essentially, black operations were not only caught dealing arms illegally and supporting South American dictators, but also smuggling drugs into the United States. Meet Barry Seal. At first, the media portrayed Seal as a drug dealer gone good, who was assassinated by the Colombian mafia.
Authorities believe last night's machine gun killing of top drug informant Barry Seal was ordered by drug bosses in Medellin, Colombia, who sent 5 men to Baton Rouge to kill Seal.
Sam Dalton was the lawyer that represented the Colombian hitmen convicted of his assassination. We were trying to subpoena the CIA because we felt like they had documents, exhibits, and evidence that would indicate complicity in Seal's assassination. When they were able to gain access of Barry Seal's trunk the night of the murder, the personal phone number of none other than George H.W. Bush was present. Louis Unglesby, the former attorney for Mr. Seal, also confirms that he once called the office of the vice president after Seal had given him the number. You see, the Black Ops drug smuggling operation had not yet been exposed, and intelligence couldn't take any chances. Despite all of the evidence that has just been presented, this network would fall down the memory hole, even though 14 convictions were made in the Iran-Contra scandal. The continued cover-up would be made possible by George H.W. Bush.
These documents that came forward in the North trial clearly reveal the involvement of the vice president to a greater degree, I think, than he has acknowledged heretofore.
This, of course, did not stop him from pardoning those involved during the twilight of his presidency.
Some new reverberations today to President Bush's Christmas Eve surprise, the pardoning of former Defense Secretary Caspar Weinberger and several others in connection with the Iran-Contra allegations. Well, now the special prosecutor says it's the president who needs to explain some things.
The Al-Qaeda was essentially a kind of a byproduct of Brzezinski's campaign to embarrass the Soviet Union in Afghanistan. They weren't in Afghanistan at that time. Brzezinski boasted later that he was responsible for drawing them into Afghanistan.
Well, the reason I bring it up, if you've ever heard any of our call-in shows, you know that we have people that think about the conspiracy theories of people like you. You would be a poster child for these people because you have served on the board of the Council on Foreign Relations. You helped start the Trilateral Commission, and you've been to the Bilderberger Group. Are people too close in this world, people in business, too close to the governments?
Well, you know, there is such a thing as insidious influence. And the question is, how does it operate? Does it involve bribery? And does it involve some sort of psychological domination of individuals? I don't believe in this notion of some sort of secret societies controlling people. But of course, in any political system, there are sort of over the table and under the table arrangements.
Arrangements that involved ruthless, illegal, and immoral activities in order to dominate humanity.
U.S. National Security Advisor Brzezinski flew to Pakistan to set about rallying resistance. He wanted to arm the Mujahideen without revealing America's role. On the Afghan border near the Khyber Pass, he urged the soldiers of God to redouble their efforts.
We know of their deep belief in God, and we are confident that their struggle will succeed. That land over there is yours. You'll go back to it one day because your fight will prevail and you'll have your homes and your mosques back again because your cause is right and God is on your side.
He has proven to be an outstanding friend and somebody who I've learned an immense amount from, and for him to support me in this campaign and then be willing to come out here to Iowa is a testimony to his generosity. So if everybody could please give Dr. Brzezinski another round of applause.
In earlier times, it was easier to control 1 million people than physically to kill 1 million people. Today, it is infinitely easier to kill 1 million people than to control 1 million people. It is easier to kill than to control.
You know J.R. Ewing in the show Dallas? J.R. is a member of the Trilateral Commission, I think. It's got to be because it's so bad. Let me tell you something. I used to be a member of it. I resigned, as I did from every business thing I was in, to concentrate on one thing: running for President of the United States.
Ronald Reagan initially had no interest in having Bush as his running mate.
Even then presidential candidate Ronald Reagan had questions.
I would suggest that maybe Mr. Bush would clear the air if he'd tell us why he resigned.
Reagan's backers then forced him to choose their intelligence frontman, George H.W. Bush, as his vice president.
But in spite of last year's campaign rhetoric, all seems to be back to normal between George Bush and his old colleagues. And President Reagan, who is relying on many of these powerful business leaders to make his economic package work, will host commission representatives at the White House Monday.
After Reagan's election, there was an attempt on his life, just 69 days into office. Astoundingly, Bush would again be connected.
So just who is John Hinckley, Jr.?
When he left this neighborhood 8 years ago, he was, by all accounts, well-liked and seemingly normal.
This donut shop near the motel was visited by Hinckley, who reportedly waited for a phone call here each day, even though he had a phone in his motel room. The nature of the calls is not known.
A touch of irony. The young man walking with the elder Hinckley is 30-year-old Scott Hinckley, John Jr.'s brother. He and Vice President Bush's son, Neil, are friends. They had planned to have dinner together in Denver tonight. The plans have been canceled.
We were told Hinckley was a madman acting alone. If that was the case, why was he making phone calls from a payphone down the road instead of his hotel room? Why was the would-be assassin's brother a family friend of the man who stood to gain the presidency? In 1978, the House Select Committee on Assassinations could not ignore there was a conspiracy in regards to the assassination of John F. Kennedy and Martin Luther King Jr.
Good evening. A congressional committee has concluded that President John Kennedy and civil rights leader Martin Luther King Jr., both of them, were probably killed as the result of conspiracies. The House Assassinations Committee wound up its 2-year study by recommending that the Justice Department look into both cases.
In the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King, the committee concluded the likelihood of conspiracy. The committee's summary of findings says President Kennedy was probably assassinated as a result of a conspiracy, that its evidence establishes a high probability that 2 gunmen fired at the motorcade. The committee concluded that President Kennedy did not receive adequate Secret Service protection in Dallas, that the CIA was deficient in sharing information before and after, that the Justice Department and Warren Commission failed to pursue possible conspiracies and made their conclusions too definite.
There seems to be no debate that the CIA and Secret Service were involved in the assassination, as you can clearly see 2 Secret Service agents being taken away from their positions at the back of Kennedy's vehicle just moments before the assassination. And no matter what you believe about Oswald, it has now been declassified that Oswald was trained by the CIA in 1957 under the cover of the Office of Naval Intelligence. Assassination is an option when the ruling class can identify an enemy who cannot be compromised. But how do they bend the population's will to do their bidding?
Well, the false flag operation is one in which the attacker carries the flag of someone else. It's usually a military operation, and the purpose, of course, is to create the impression that the attacker is someone else.
It is used in order to seize power at an accelerated pace. A very well-documented modern example of this is the Tonkin Gulf incident.
To this day, I don't know what happened on August 2nd and August 4th, 1964 in the Tonkin Gulf.
The general provided the answer, saying his Navy attacked the Maddox on August 2nd. But on the 4th, nothing happened. There was absolutely nothing, he said. The revelation may be important to historians. They have argued for years that the second incident on August 4th never occurred. But Lyndon Johnson used it to justify air attacks on Vietnam and broaden the scope of the war.
Events afterwards showed that our judgment that we'd been attacked that day was wrong.
Remarks of the President to the American Newspaper Publishers Association, Waldorf Astoria Hotel, New York City, April 27, 1961.
The very word secrecy is repugnant in a free and open society, and we are, as a people, inherently and historically opposed to secret societies, to secret oaths, and to secret proceedings. We decided long ago that the dangers of excessive and unwarranted concealment of pertinent facts far outweighed the dangers which are cited to justify it. Even today, there is little value in opposing the threat of a closed society by imitating its arbitrary restrictions. Even today, there is little value in ensuring the survival of our nation if our traditions do not survive with it. And there is very grave danger that an announced need for increased security will be seized upon by those anxious to expand its meaning to the very limits of official censorship and concealment. That I do not intend to permit to the extent that it's in my control. For we are opposed around the world by a monolithic and ruthless conspiracy that relies primarily on covert means for expanding its sphere of influence. It is a system which has conscripted vast human and material resources into the building of a tightly knit, highly efficient machine that combines military, diplomatic, intelligence, economic, scientific, and political operations. Its preparations are concealed, not published. Its mistakes are buried, not headlined. Its dissenters are silenced, not praised. No expenditure is questioned, no rumor is printed, no secret is revealed. And so it is to the printing press, to the recorder of man's deeds, the keeper of his conscience, the courier of his news, that we look for strength and assistance, confident that with your help, man will be what he was born to be, free and independent.
Under the second Bush administration, massive amounts of civil liberties were openly and brazenly taken away following 9/11. The passage of the Patriot Acts, the Military Commissions Act, and other horrifying anti-constitutional legislation was enabled by the incredible amount of fear generated by the media, all in the name of keeping us safe here at home. The war itself would create huge profits for the military-industrial complex, and the globalists would seize even more power and control over Middle Eastern resources in what they planned to become a Eurasian Union under their control. Although the establishment claimed to be fighting for our freedom abroad, they were destroying our sovereignty by stealth. Expanding on NAFTA, they were able to consolidate power on the domestic front by deindustrializing the United States through CAFTA, the Central American Free Trade Agreement, as well as the SPP, the Securities and Prosperity Partnership.
Opponents, however, say the initiative is nothing less than a plan to create a North American Union that would eliminate sovereignty for all three nations. That's a plan from the business elites, the political elites, that will cost more American jobs, cost American sovereignty, but it would fulfill the president's father's vision. It's remarkable to me, the arrogance, the idea of just simply throwing away the nation's sovereignty, but they're trying to do so in so many ways. People better understand that they mean exactly what they're saying. It's a new world order they're trying to create.
Dobbs, the only mainstream anchor to expose the New World Order, resigned shortly after bullets were fired into his home.
There is a big thing that's going to happen in London at this G20, and then they're hiding it, they're camouflaging it, they're not talking about it. Coordination of international regulation. What they are going to do is to put our Fed and our SEC under the control, in effect, of the IMF. What it really is putting the American economy under international regulation. Yeah. And those people who have been yelling, oh, the UN's going to take over global
conspiracy
government.
Theorists.
They've been crazy, but now they're right.
Those conspiracy people had said and suggested that for years. Right. You're not wrong.
So it should come as no surprise that they have been tracking, tracing, and databasing our lives for years. Many people are aware that the Bush administration engaged in warrantless wiretaps on American citizens. What they don't understand is that it has come out in court that all the major telecommunications companies have been secretly storing every piece of data received from our phones and our computers and handing them over to the National Security Agency.
You heard about the government secretly listening in on phone conversations without a warrant, but there is evidence that your email is also being tapped.
The government has been intercepting most emails as part of its terrorist surveillance program. That program has been criticized as illegal because it's missing an important ingredient: search warrants.
Internal documents released in March of 2009 reveal that the Department of Homeland Security is targeting citizens who discussed the New World Order, people with a Christian identity, or sovereign citizens who argue that the government has gotten away from the intent of the Constitution and are strong states' rights advocates. People who are anti-immigration, stating, extremists will argue that immigrants are taking the jobs of U.S. citizens during times of high unemployment and without paying taxes. People who oppose the Federal Reserve banking system. People who display constitutional party or libertarian material. People who support Ron Paul. And those who have bumper stickers containing anti-government rhetoric. This document is one of literally thousands that make everyone a possible terrorist. This establishes a pattern of demonizing ordinary citizens while giving draconian powers to the state. You are considered guilty until proven innocent. So is there anything else about the ruling class we should know? Politicians, business leaders, and media figures are often portrayed as pillars of morality while they describe themselves as Christian conservatives. Nothing could be further from the truth.
You were both in Skull and Bones, the secret society.
It's so secret we can't talk about it.
What does that mean for America? The conspiracy theorists are going to go
I'm
wild.
sure they are. I don't know. I haven't seen the web.
Number 322?
First of all, he's not the nominee. And, look, I look forward...
Are you prepared to lose?
No, I'm not going to lose.
You both were members of Skull and Bones, a secret society at Yale. What does that tell us?
Not much, because it's a secret.
Is there a secret handshake? Is there a secret code?
I wish there were something secret I could manifest.
322, a secret number?
There are all kinds of secrets, Tim, but one thing is not a secret. I disagree with this president's direction that he's taking the country. We can do a better job, and I intend to do it.
This is an elaborate, occult, ritualistic entry into this group that they are now a member of for life.
World Trade Center 7 was brought down on September 11th at 5:20 in the evening. The leaseholder of the World Trade Center complex, Larry Silverstein, gave a public interview on PBS in 2002, and he said that they pulled that building, which is a demolition term for intentionally bringing down a building. This man made over $5 billion from those buildings' destruction. And I want to know if there was ever a formal investigation into Larry Silverstein, the leaseholder of the World Trade Center complex, and his ties to this entire event.
I don't believe there's been a formal investigation. I haven't heard that. I don't know that. I do know that that wall, I remember, was in danger, and I think that they made a decision based on the danger that it had of destroying other things, that they did it in a controlled fashion.
I know you said there'll be a time for politics, but you've also said you wanted to change the tone of Washington. Howard Dean recently seemed to muse aloud whether you had advanced knowledge of 9/11. Do you agree or disagree with the RNC that this kind of rhetoric borders on political hate speech?
Yeah. Look, there's time for politics. And, you know, it's time for politics. And it's an absurd insinuation.
In that case, sir, can I follow up on something unrelated?
We're going to take a closer look tonight at another example of where, despite the conventional wisdom, there were people in the United States who actually were preparing to defend against the kind of attacks which occurred here on 9/11. The North American Aerospace Defense Command, NORAD for short, has been defending the skies over the U.S. and Canada for almost 50 years, 46 to be precise. USA Today reports that in the 2 years before the attacks on September the 11th, NORAD conducted exercises using hijacked airliners as weapons. And one target was the World Trade Center. Here's ABC's Brian Ross.
President Bush has said again and again that no one could have imagined what Osama bin Laden ordered for September 11th.
We knew he hated us. But there was nobody in our government, at least, and I don't think the prior government, that could envision flying airplanes into buildings on such a massive scale.
But that turns out not to be true. U.S. military planners did envision and practice those very scenarios. As reported by USA Today, the North American Aerospace Defense Command, NORAD, conducted exercises with fighter jets, simulating hijacked planes flown into the World Trade Center in the 2 years before the attacks. Still to come are questions, big questions, about NORAD's response on the day of the attack. Why, despite all the exercises and the planning, Peter, jet fighters were not in place anywhere near New York or Washington.
Quite an amazing story. Many thanks, Brian. Brian Ross on 9/11.
The ultimate goal that these people have in mind is the goal to create a one world government run by the banking industry, run by the bankers, and they're doing it in sections. The European currency, the euro, and the European Constitution is one part of it. Now they're trying to do it in America with the North American Union, right? And they want to create a new currency called the Amero, right? And the whole agenda is to create a one world government where everybody has an RFID chip implanted in them. All money is to be in those chips, right? There'll be no more cash. And this is given me straight from Rockefeller himself. This is what they want to accomplish. And all money will be in your chips. And so instead of having cash, anytime you have money in your chip, they can take out whatever they want to take out whenever they want to. If they say you owe us this much money in taxes, they just deduct it out of your chip digitally.
Total control.
Total control. And if you're like me or you, and you're protesting what they're doing, they can just turn off your chip. And you have nothing. You can't buy food. You can't do anything. It's total control of the people.
And that chip's connected to a database that has your purchasing records, what you do, what
everything,
you sell.
Everything is in there, you know? And so they want a one world government controlled by them, everybody being chipped, all your money in those chips, and they control the chips, and they control people. And you become a slave. You become a serf to these people. That's their goal. That's their intentions.
Eric, can you be specific about when you met Rockefeller, how it happened in these discussions?
I met Rockefeller through a female attorney I knew who called me up one day and said, one of the Rockefellers would like to meet you. I had made a video called Mad as Hell, and he'd seen the video and wanted to meet me and knew I was running for governor of Nevada. So sure, I'd love to meet him. And I met him, and I liked him, and he was a very, very smart man. And we used to talk and share ideas and thoughts. And he's the one who told me 11 months before 9/11 ever happened that there was going to be an event. Never told me what the event was going to be, but there was going to be an event. And out of that event, we were going to invade Afghanistan to run pipelines from the Caspian Sea. we were going to invade Iraq, you know, to take over the oil fields, establish a base in the Middle East, and make it all part of the New World Order. And we'd go after Chavez in Venezuela. And sure enough, later 9/11 happened, and I remember he was telling me how how you're gonna see soldiers looking in caves for people in Afghanistan and Pakistan and all these places, and there's gonna be this war on terror, of which there's no real enemy, and the whole thing is a giant hoax, you know. But it's a way for the government to take over the American people.
He told you it was going to be a hoax.
Oh yeah, oh yeah.
Our constitutional journey did not stop then, and it must not stop now, Judge. And we'll be faced with equally consequential decisions in the 21st century. Can a microscopic tag be implanted in a person's body to track his every movement? There's actual discussion about that. You will rule on that, mark my words, before your tenure is over.
The story you are about to hear represents a missing piece in the puzzle of modern history. Without this knowledge, many contemporary events are simply beyond understanding. The man who tells this story is none other than Mr. Norman Dodd, who in 1954 was the staff director of the Congressional Special Committee to investigate tax-exempt foundations, sometimes referred to as the Reese Committee, in recognition of its chairman, Congressman Carroll Reese.
And I was fortunate enough to secure a position in one of the important banks in New York, and lived there. I lived through the conditions which led up to what is known as the crash of 1929, and I witnessed what is tantamount to a collapse of the structure of the United States as a whole. And much to my surprise, I was confronted by my superiors with in the middle of the panic in which they were immersed, I was confronted with the question, Norm, what do we do now? I was 30 at the time, and I had no more right to have an answer to that question than the man in the moon. However, I did manage to say to my superiors, gentlemen, you take this experience as proof of something that you do not know about banking, and you better go find out what that something is and act accordingly. 4 days later, I was confronted by the same superiors with a statement to the effect that, Norm, you go find out. And I really was fool enough to accept that assignment, because it meant that you were going out to search for something and nobody could tell you what you were looking for. But I felt so strongly on the subject that I consented to. I was relieved of all normal duties inside the bank, and 2.5 years later I felt that it was possible to report back to those who had given me this assignment. And so I rendered such a report, and as a result of the report I rendered, I was told the following, Norm, what you're saying is we should return to sound banking. And I said, yes, in essence, that's exactly what I'm saying. Whereupon I got my first shock, which was a statement from them to this effect. We will never see sound banking in the United States again. And they cited chapter and verse to support that statement. And what they cited was as follows. Since the end of World War I, we have been responsible for what they call the institutionalizing of conflicting interests. And they are so prevalent inside this country that they can never be resolved. This came to me as an extraordinary shock because the men who made the statement were men who were deemed as the most prominent bankers in the country. The bank of which I was a part was spoken of as a Morgan Bank. And coming from men of that caliber, a statement of that kind made a tremendous impression on me.
Well, Mr. Dodd, if I may interrupt here for a second. At what point in your career did you become connected with the Reece Committee?
1953.
1953.
Yeah.
And what was that capacity, sir?
That was the capacity of what they call Director of Research for the Reece Committee.
Can you tell us what the Reece Committee was attempting to do?
Yes, I can tell you. It was operating and carrying out instructions embodied in a resolution passed by the House of Representatives, which was to investigate the activities of foundations as to whether or not these activities could justifiably be labeled un-American. What we were able to bring forward was that what we had uncovered was the determination of these large endowed foundations through their trustees to actually get control over the content of American education.
There's quite a bit of publicity given to your conversation with Rowan Gaither. Would you please tell us who he was and what was that conversation you had with him?
Rowan Gaither was at that time president of the Ford Foundation. I said, yes, Mr. Gaither, I'd like very much to know. Whereupon he made this statement to me, namely, Mr. Dodd, we are here operate on in response to similar directives, the substance of which is that we shall use our grant-making power so to alter life in the United States that it can be comfortably merged with the Soviet Union. Well, parenthetically, Mr. Griffin, I nearly fell off the chair. I, of course, didn't, but my response to Mr. Gaither then was, well, Mr. Gaither, I can now answer your first question. You forced the Congress of the United States to spend $150,000 to find out what you just told me. So why don't you I said, of course, legally you're entitled to make grants for this purpose, but I don't think you're entitled to withhold that information from the people of the country to whom you're indebted for your tax exemption. So why don't you tell the people of the country that's what you've told me? And his answer was, we would not think of doing any such thing. So then I said, well, Mr. Gaither, obviously, you forced the Congress to spend this money in order to find out what you just told me.
Mr. Dodd, you have spoken before about some interesting things that were discovered by Catherine Casey at the Carnegie Endowment. Can you tell us that story, please?
Yes, I'm glad to, Mr. Griffin. This experience that you have just referred to came about in response to a letter which I had written to the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, asking certain questions and gathering certain information. And on the arrival of that letter, Dr. Johnson, who was then president of the Carnegie Endowment, telephoned me and said, did I ever come up to New York? And I said, yes, I did, more or less each weekend. And he said, well, when you're next here, will you drop in and see us? Which I did. And again, on arrival at the office of the endowment, I found myself in the presence of Dr. Joseph Johnson, the president, who was a successor to Alger Hiss, two vice presidents, and their own counsel, a partner in the firm Sullivan and Cromwell. And Dr. Johnson said, after, again, amenities, Mr. Dodd, we have your letter. We can answer all those questions, but it'd be a great deal of trouble. And we have a counter-suggestion. And our counter-suggestion is that if you can spare a member of your staff for 2 weeks and send that member up to New York, we will give to that member a room in the library and the minute books of this foundation since its inception. And we think that whatever you want to find out or the Congress wants to find out will be obvious from those minutes. Well, my first reaction was they'd lost their mind. I had a pretty good idea of what those minutes would contain, but I realized that Dr. Johnson had only been in office 2 years, and the vice presidents were relatively young men, and counsel seemed to be also a young man, and I guessed that probably they'd never read the minutes themselves. And so I said I had somebody, I would take it. I would accept their offer, and I went back to Washington, and I selected the member of my staff who was on my staff, having been a practicing attorney in Washington, but she was on my staff to see to it that I didn't break any congressional procedures or rules. In addition to which, she was unsympathetic to the purpose of the investigation. She was level-headed and a very reasonably brilliant, capable lady. And her attitude toward the investigation was, what could possibly be wrong with foundations? They do so much good. Well, in the face of that sincere conviction of Catherine's, I went out of my way not to prejudice her in any way. But I did explain to her that she couldn't possibly cover 50 years of handwritten minutes in 2 weeks. So she would have to do what we call spot reading. And I blocked out certain periods of time to concentrate on. And off she went to New York. She came back at the end of 2 weeks with the following in the way of, on dictaphone belts. We are now at the year 1908, which was the year that the Carnegie began operations. And in that year, the trustees, meeting for the first time, raised a specific question, which they discussed throughout the balance of the year in a very learned fashion. And the question is there any means known more effective than war, assuming you wish to alter the life of an entire people? And they conclude that no more effective means than war to that end is known to humanity. So then, in 1909, they raised the second question and discussed it, namely, how do we involve the United States in a war? Well, I doubt at that time if there was any subject more removed from the thinking of most of the people of this country than its involvement in a war. There were intermittent shows in the Balkans, but I doubt very much if many people even knew where the Balkans was. Then finally, they answer that question as follows. We must control the State Department. And then that very naturally raises the question of how do we do that? And they answer it by saying we must take over and control the diplomatic machinery of this country. And finally, they resolve to aim at that as an objective. Then time passes, and we are eventually in a war, which would have been World War I. And at that time, they record on their minutes a shocking report in which they dispatched to President Wilson a telegram cautioning him to see that the war does not end too quickly. And finally, of course, the war is over. At that time, their interest shifts over to preventing what they call a reversion of life in the United States to what it was prior to 1914, when World War I broke out. And they arrive at that point, they come to the conclusion that to prevent a reversion, we must control education in the United States. And they realize that that's a pretty big task. So to them, it is too big for them alone, so they approach the Rockefeller Foundation with the suggestion that that portion of education which could be considered domestic be handled by the Rockefeller Foundation, and that portion which is international should be handled by the endowment. And they then decide that the key to the success of these two operations lay in an alteration in the teaching of American history.
This is the story that emerged from the minutes of the Carnegie Fund.
That's right.
The Carnegie Endowment
That's
Fund.
right.
And so...
It was official to that extent.
I see. And Catherine Casey brought all of these back in the form of dictated notes or verbatim readings of the minutes.
On dictaphone belts.
Are those in existence today?
I don't know. If they are, they're somewhere in the archives under the control of the Congress, House of Representatives.
How many people actually heard those, or were they typed up transcripts made of them? How many people actually heard those recordings?
Oh, 3 maybe. Myself, my top assistants, and Catherine. Yeah, I might tell you this experience as far as its impact on Catherine Casey was concerned was she never was able to return to her law practice. If it hadn't been for Carol Reese's ability to tuck her away on a job with the Federal Trade Commission, I don't know what would have happened to Catherine, but ultimately she lost her mind as a result of it. Terrible shock to her.
I'm Joel Skousen, editor of World Affairs Brief. I'm a political scientist by training, was the former chairman of the Conservative National Committee during the Reagan administration, and have been active ever since in trying to alert people to what's going on in the world. Once you see someone parroting the establishment line, you have to ask, is he part of the establishment or is he not part of it? I'm going to take you through a truth diagram here of yes or no and then where to go from that. If a person is not part of the establishment, but he's parroting the establishment line, he's usually being used because of several reasons. One, either they're too ambitious. I put Mitt Romney in that category. Mitt Romney is not a corrupt individual, but he's someone bending over backwards so badly to please the establishment because he wants to be accepted by them. He wants to rise. He wants to be president. I think Rush Limbaugh, for example, started out on the right side. He was very conservative. He was very pro-understanding of conspiracy. He warned openly and almost constantly in his radio shows about conspiracy. At some point, they made an offer that was too big to pass up. Something like $3 million to go over and become part of the big radio networks. But at some point during those negotiations, I believe someday we'll find out, if not in this life, on the other side, that they gave him a message that part of the deal is that you can't push this conspiracy stuff anymore. Because literally the first or second show out of the gate under the new radio network, he began not just to say, which would have been legitimate had he said, I have my doubts about my previous thoughts about conspiracy. I'm still open, but I have doubts about this. And because conspiracy is something we never have all of the answers about. But no, he didn't take that moderate position of saying, I have doubts now. He took the position of vilifying and denigrating and attacking anyone who called up. And most of his listeners had been used to talking about conspiracy. And they called up thinking, I'm going to talk about the same conspiracy I talked to last week with Rush. And he began to attack them and blow them away. The same thing happens with Sean Hannity and Bill O'Reilly. Now, they're very, very good about attacking Democrats. They never attack Republicans. Glenn Beck will attack Republicans. He did attack President Bush when he went outside the constitutional frame. But Hannity and O'Reilly will never attack a Republican. Whatever is a Democrat is open game, and that's why they have a great time during a Democratic administration like Obama or Bill Clinton. But their true colors come out, in my opinion, when they come up with a conspiracy issue, whether it's the Obama birth certificate, and they literally will lash in, break up, interrupt their phrase, won't let them finish a phrase. They will not let anyone competent finish a phrase about conspiracy.